Today's daf we're going to be learning is Shevuot Daf Yud. This week's learning is sponsored by Moshe Silver in loving memory of Rabbi Miriam Maxine Elkins, who passed away on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Her love of Torah, the Jewish people, and the land and state of Israel was unsurpassed. Her loving family, Rabbi Dov Peretz Elkin, and her children bear the lasting imprint of the passion she brought to everything she did, as do all of us who loved her. This week's learning is sponsored by Vicky Harari in loving memory of her father, Abraham Eckstein. He had a smile that could light up the room. He taught me what I know about love. As a Holocaust survivor, he taught me gratitude and resilience, something I've been relying on more today than ever. We're going to get started with our daf. So before we start, I want to share screen. I highly recommend you use the study guide today. It will definitely help organize the daf. We're going to start with the bottom of the study guide, which is a chart that we've already seen it for a few of the shiurim since we started this masechet. Hopefully by the end of today, you really have all these opinions down pat because we're going to really delve into them. We're not going to focus on Rabbi Yehuda, and we're not going to focus on the Shiur on the Korbano Levi Yored. So the Korbano Levi Yored is off the table for today, and Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is off the table for today. So we're going to focus. I'm going to kind of focus in on what we are going to focus on, which is we're going to compare the Shiur that's done inside on Yom Kippur, the Shiur that's done outside on Yom Kippur, the Shiurei Regalim, the ones brought in the holidays, and the Shiurei Roshei Chodeshim. And we have three different opinions we're going to deal with today. And what we want to see today is what is the source for the different opinions? And we're going to ask some directed questions about each one of them, each of these three opinions, and try to understand what the basis of the machlokot are between them. So we start off with the first Rabbi Shimon, which is the Shiur that's done outside, okay, and Yom Kippurim itself helps atone for this, atones for the sin of Tumat Mikdash v'Kodoshav, right? Again, general topic of all this is it all has to do with the temple and some impurity in the temple or sacrificial items. And it's where you didn't know in the beginning, but you did figure out in the end, the Shiur, which is done outside in Yom Kippur, atones for that. The Regalim are the opposite. Not the opposite. It's the last opinion, the last option, which is you had no yediah at all and you have no yediah at the end. You didn't know from the beginning that you were impure. You don't even know now that you're impure. You never figured out anything. And that we atone for every holiday. And Rosh Chodesh, according to Rabbi Shimon, is something completely different. Not completely, but instead of talking about a person who's impure, the object is impure. And it's a pure person who ate sacrificial object, item, like meat or something, that became impure. So that's Rabbi Shimon. So according to Rabbi Shimon, just to really clarify, according to Rabbi Shimon, each of these three is a totally, completely different purpose, okay? Now, let's skip down to Rabbi Meir, because he's the second that we're going to deal with today. According to Rabbi Meir, the three that we just discussed, okay, forgetting about the Shiur Nasa B'fnim, which clearly stands alone, which we'll talk about why it clearly stands alone and how we get that, but all the other Shiurim, the ones that are all done on the outer altar, whether it's Rosh Chodesh, holidays, or Yom Kippur, all have the same purpose, and they actually have a number of purposes, okay? So they can do all three. I'm not going to go through all three, but the three we just said, according to Rabbi Shimon, this one, this one, that one, that, all three of those are for all three korbanot, okay? It's the easy approach, the easy shita. Everything's clumped together, and all three of them atone for that. And then we get to Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, who says in the name of the original Rabbi Shimon, who's Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So then we have a third approach. Now, this approach is sort of an in-between approach, and that's why I wanted to go that extreme, right? Either each one has its own unique purpose and no overlap, or they all have the same purpose, to complete overlap, to partial overlap. And we'll start with Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is just Tahor Shachalat Tamid. Regalim builds on that and adds another one. And the one, Samchutz and Yom Kippur, builds on the other two and adds another one. Okay? And that's the second approach of Rabbi Shimon. Excuse me for a minute. And that explains our three approaches. So now we're going to start with a question on Rabbi Shimon. We already started with Rabbi Shimon yesterday. Learning from the tzitz, how we know that Rabbi Shimon, who adds this new thing about the tahor shachalat tameh, that's talking about the person was pure and eating impure items, that we learn from the tzitz. So now I'm going to start 5 lines from the bottom of Terem Bet. Eshkachan sirei Roshei Chodeshim demachapre al tahor shachalat tameh. Okay, we get that we just established. The Rosh Chodeshim atone for the Seir, and Rosh Chodeshim atone for someone who's pure who eats impure items. But Seirei Regalim, our focus right now completely is, although it's going to compare to all the others, is on this part of the chart. How do we know that Seirei Regalim atone for sins that have to do with the Kodesh, like, again, you ate or you were tamid and you went and you ate sacrificial meat or went into the temple, but in a case where you didn't have any knowledge in the beginning that you were even impure, and after you went into the temple or after you ate the sacrificial items, you still have no idea. How do we know it's that? And we're going to basically say, how do we know it's that? And that it doesn't also atone for Rosh Chodesh? And how do we know that it doesn't also atone for what the Seir B'chutz on Yom Kippur is atoning for? Okay, we're going to go through all that. So that's our question. And for this, we're going to have a long answer. K'da'amar Rabbi Chama b'Rabbi Chanina, Seir u'Seir. Hachanami Seir u'Seir. Just like Rabbi Chama darshans, this Seir and Seir, also we're going to darshan this here. Okay, what's the Seir and Seir drasha? If you remember in Bamidbar, chapter 28 and 29, when it lists all the sacrifices, every time it lists the Seir izim l'chatat, it says u'Seir izim, u'Seir izim, u'Seir izim l'chatat. So each time it mentions all the holidays, it says end. And the first one was Rosh Chodesh. So we're going to say, from here you can learn, you can make a hekesh. These are compared one to the other. Masir de Rosh Chodesh b'milta de Kodesh mechapre. Af sirei regalim b'milta de Kodesh mechapre. Okay, now, you might have thought the sirei regalim, it's a sin offering. Maybe it's coming for some other sin. So now we're going to say, the seir u'seir drasha. Now, I said something not exactly correct, because I said every time it appears as a vav, it's not true. We'll talk about that later. Okay, there are two exceptions where it doesn't have a vav. But let's just go with right now all of them, okay, even though it's not true. I just want you to know that I said something that's not actually accurate. But let's just right now go with this. We're going to learn from this that the content or the general title for the Seir on the Regalim is like the general title on the Seir Rosh Chodesh. And the Seir on Rosh Chodesh is for someone who was pure but ate something impure. Well, the Seir Regalim are also going to come to deal with some sort of impurity surrounding the temple and sacrificial items. Okay? That just gets us the hekesh, gets us to the general idea. Now, the chitema, but now we have to get it more specific. So which one is it? If you want to say Nichapru ad Rosh Chodesh, okay, well then, if it's the same as Rosh Chodesh, the easy thing to say would be the vavs are there to say it actually atones for the exact same thing, which according to Rabbi Shimon is someone pure who eats something impure, but we know that's not the case. So why not? Ha'amrinan ota, otano se'avon ve'en acher no se'avon. Okay, for that we have this drasha. This is a pasuk in Vayikra Yud where it's talking about the Seir of Rosh Chodesh that they actually brought on the day of the Miluim, the Miluim ceremony when they consecrated this tabernacle. It says there was this whole discussion about the Seir Chatat on Rosh Chodesh, which we've mentioned before this pasuk. Ota natan lachem. This was given to you to do, right, to atone. So now they say, Otano se'avon ve'en acher no se'avon. If you want to atone for this particular sin, it's just the Chatat Rosh Chodesh, meaning whatever the Chatat Rosh Chodesh is mechaper, which according to Rabbi Shimon is tarosh chalat tamid, otana tamachem. This is the sacrifice that covers it. No other sacrifice. Okay, so that one's out. So in other words, again, we did a comparison. Whatever is true for the Rosh Chodesh is true for the Regalim, but not completely. Just the general topic, but not the specific, because we have this specific that says only this, okay? Meaning only the Seir on Rosh Chodesh atones for whatever sin it's atoning for, okay? Not any other korban. Okay, so now, if it's not going to atone for Rosh Chodesh, maybe it'll atone for what the Seir b'chutz on Yom Kippur is atoning for. V'chitema, that's what they're going to suggest right now. Nichapru ad Yom Kippurim. Maybe it's going to atone for what Yom Kippur atones for, the one done outside. No, there's a separate drasha there, kind of like the Ota, which is achat b'shana. Okay, the pasuk is, okay, so we're going to get a little confused with this pasuk because the pasuk is actually talking about, first of all, not the one that's done outside, which is what we're using it to teach us. It's actually, the context there is the Seir nasa b'fnim on Yom Kippur, okay, the inner one. And the pasuk in two places says achat b'shana, and we're going to darshan each one as we go on. But it says here, "V'chiper Aharon al karnotav achat b'shana." Aharon is going to atone on the corners of the altar, which is the inner altar, okay, one time a year. Midam chatata kippurim, from the blood of the sin offering on Yom Kippur, which is the inner offering. Achat v'shana yechaper alav ledorotechem. One time a year it will atone for the people for the generations. So now, what do they say here? Well, the first thing they do is they say, even though it's talking about the chatat, if it's done inside, we're going to take it to teach us about the chatat, which is done outside. Okay, that's what I wrote here, and I bolded it. Chatat anasa b'chutz. Okay, that's the first thing you have to do. You have to make this jump. How we make that jump, we're going to learn later. Okay, later the Gemara is going to ask this question, but not too much later. Right now, they're just taking it as a given. So now, it says achat b'shana. Now, what does it mean, achat b'shana yichapel? Kapara zo lo tehei ela achat b'shana. Again, the same thing as otanatan lachem, right? This type of atonement is only going to happen once a year, which means that you can't say that the regalim are atoning for the same thing. So if you say that what's done on the bachutz, which is what's on the bachutz, right? She'ein b'yediah b'tchila v'yesh b'yediah b'sof. It's a case where you didn't know in the beginning you were impure, and then you found out later you were impure. That's what we have, right? Right, that's here. Ein b'yediah b'tchila, aval yesh b'yediah b'sof. Okay, so you didn't know about it in the beginning, but you find out later. That's what the Seir is atoning for. Don't apply that also to the regalim, because that only happens once a year. You can't do it another 3 times. Okay, so now on my machapre. Okay, so now what's left? Okay, and now we're going to do process of elimination. Okay, because now we basically have everything else covered. We know that the Seir Nasa B'fnim on Yom Kippur is you knew about in the beginning, you forgot about at the end. The Seir that's done outside is you didn't know in the beginning, you did know at the end. The Seir Rosh Chodesh is Tamesh Atawar Shachalat Tamid. So there's only one thing left, which is Ein B'yediah Lo B'tchila V'Lo B'sof. You had no knowledge of it whatsoever. Because remember, the first thing we did today was establish it has to do somehow with impurity in the temple. Okay, so that's what we're going to go through right now. Process of elimination. And what I just did, we're going to read it inside. Oh, I didn't even mention that one. Okay, if you knew about it in the beginning and then you forgot, and then you found out at the end, Haibar Korbanhu. Okay, that's the Korban Olevi Yoreh. For sure, it's not that. If you knew about it in the beginning but didn't know about it, and now you still haven't figured it out, that's done by the Seir that's on the inside on Yom Kippur and Yom Kippurim itself. If you didn't know it about the beginning, but you did find out about it later, having not known at the time it happened or before that you were even impure, that's the one undone on Yom Kippur in the outside. Korcha, what are you left with? Again, process of elimination. Okay, you're left with what Rabbi Shimon says, Sirei Regalim. So basically what we did here was a little bit complicated, but we have one simple question, or I don't know, simple, but complicated question. What does the Seir, how do we know? How did Rabbi Shimon get to the fact that the Seirei HaRegalim, the ones done on the holidays, are atoning for Ein B'yediah Lo B'tchila V'Lo B'sof? And basically we had to go through. Why isn't it also atoning for Rosh Chodesh? And why isn't it also atoning for this year on Yom Kippur, right? And each time we had some sort of drasha which said, oh no, this one only atones for it, right? That atonement only comes once a year, and that atonement only comes once a year. And then we were basically left with, and the Seir V'Seir said it is the same category, general category. So then we're basically left by process of elimination with that's all that's left. Okay. That was Rabbi Shimon. We're going to come back to Rabbi Shimon. That was one specific question about the Seirei Regalim according to Rabbi Shimon. But now, before we get back to Rabbi Shimon, we're going to move to Rabbi Meir. And now we're going to go through Rabbi Meir's drasha. You can see here, there's cross out here on the chart, because we're going to suggest something and then reject it. Rabbi Meir Omer, Kol HaSeirim Kaparatan Shabbat. So now remember Rabbi Meir's unique approach. All the Seirim on the one done outside on Yom Kippur, the holidays, and Rosh Chodesh, all have the same purpose, and they cover 3 things. Obviously, you're going to have a problem because what happened to Otana, Tanlachem, and all that. Okay, but he thinks they're all 3 the same. Amar Rabbi Chama bar Rabbi Chanina, right? That one obviously he thinks is different is the Seir Nasa B'fnim. That everyone agrees is unique. But He thinks those three are the same. Amar Rabbi Chama bar Rabbi Chanina, my taima. So what's the reason? The same rabbi you said before. What's the reason for Rabbi Meir? Amar kras seir useir hukshu kol seirim zelazeh. He goes with the seir drasha all the way, not like we did before where we only did it part way, all the way. All the seirim atone for all the same sins. Okay, and that's because it keeps saying and the seirim and the seirim and the seirim and the seirim. Vav mosif al yam rishon. So the vav comes to say, right? This connects to the previous, connects to the previous, connects to the previous. Now, now they thought originally that when he said this, what he meant is you learn the first holiday from Rosh Chodesh, and then the next holiday for the previous holiday, and then the next holiday from the previous holiday, and then each one keeps connecting to the Seir Izim mentioned before it. But you can't say that because Hamar Rabbi Yochanan kol Torah kula lamedim lamed. In general, in the Torah, you can learn if you darshan, this can teach you right to something else, then that something else can teach you to something else. You're allowed to do that kind of thing. But chutz mikodeshim, but there's a special principle by sanctified items, right? Sacrificial items. She'ein lamedim lamed. In the world of the temple, right? We've talked about this. There's different rules, and one of the rules is that you can't learn something from something that was derived from somewhere else. So if we're going to say Siyam Rosh Chodesh is X, and then from there we learn to the first holiday, and from the first holiday we learn to the second holiday, you can't go. You can go Rosh Chodesh to the first holiday, but you can't go first holiday to second holiday, because once you have the first holiday was derived from Rosh Chodesh, then you can't derive from that holiday to another holiday. So that's going to be a problem. Elam Rabbi Yonas, so Rabbi Yonas just correct. Oh, sorry, I skipped a line. Halakha, that's not a problem because you could say kulumi kama gamri, and that's why I wrote here. Each one was learned from the first, meaning you have Rosh Chodesh, and then each vav connects back to Rosh Chodesh. And go see Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh. And then nothing's derived from something that's derived. It's all derived from the source, and that works. But you see it's crossed out, so we're obviously going to have another problem. And this goes back to what I said before, where I didn't tell you the whole truth, which is Tinach kol dichtiv bei useir. So this works for every single holiday where there's a vav. But at Seret Yom Kippurim, but on Shevuot and on Yom Kippurim, delo ktiv bei useir minalan. But on those two holidays, there is no vav. So what are you going to say for those? If you're going to learn the least from Rosh Chodesh, and you're going to say, the vav connects it and says, we're going to learn all from there. Well, these are missing vavs. And then you have nowhere to learn it from. So cross out that answer. That's not going to work. Ela amar Rabbi Yona amar ka elu ta'asu la'Hashem b'moadechem. We're going to quote a different pasuk entirely from that same chapter from Bamidbar Kaftet, pasuk 39. Okay, it says these are what you should do la'Hashem on your moadim. How do we get it from here? Hukshu kol moadim kulan zelazeh. That compares all the holidays to each other. There's this general pasuk about all the holidays. We're going to say, all the holidays atone for the same sin. Okay, that's very simple. Now they say, well, there's one problem with that. If you're going to say all the holidays are the same, Rosh Chodesh isn't a holiday. But have Rosh Chodesh, Lav Moedu, right? Who says Rosh Chodesh is a holiday? We don't call Rosh Chodesh a holiday. Ivra, no, it really is. Rosh Chodesh, Nami Ikre Moed, you could call Rosh Chodesh a holiday. Keda'amar Abai, as Abai said, De'amar Abai, Tammuz Dahi Shat HaMaluya Malu, Dichtiv Kara Moed Lishbor B'churai. I'll give you the background to this. Cheder Meraglim, the sin of the spies. They say the spies came back on the 8th of Av, and that night everybody cried. That night was Tisha B'av. Okay, Tet B'av. Now there's a bit of a problem with the counting of the days because Tammuz is usually a month of 29 days, not 30 days, right? Every month could be 29 or 30, and then the counting doesn't really make any sense, and from the chronology of events. So Abai says that year they made it a full month. A full moon, right? It was a 30-day month. Rosh Chodesh was only on day 31, which basically is how it came about that Tisha B'av ended up on that night. And the whole idea was that God orchestrated this, right? You could say the opposite, right? Why did Tisha B'av happen then? You could have changed the date then. But already back then, God wanted it to happen on Tisha B'av because he knew that the temple was going to be destroyed on Tisha B'av. And that's basically we're reading in the Pasuk. And right, the drasha is you cried for no reason when the spies came back. And God says, I'll give you a reason to cry for future generations. But the idea is that this happened on the 9th of Av. And it's referenced, this whole concept is referenced in a pasuk from Eicha, which says, Kara alai mo'ed lishbor bachurai. Okay, that you called it a mo'ed, meaning you made Rosh Chodesh when you made it. You made the month, a full month to break my bachurim. In other words, to make this all happen on the day that in the future the temple was going to be destroyed. It's going to be a tragic day. And what do you see here? Mo'ed is when they set Rosh Chodesh. There's a reference to Rosh Chodesh, and therefore you see Rosh Chodesh is called Mo'ed. That was just a side thing to say, if Rabbi Meir learns this all from that Mo'adechem, well, you have to somehow get to the fact that Rosh Chodesh is Mo'ed, and we prove that from this pasuk. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now we have one other thing to do for Rabbi Meir. Umote Rabbi Meir b'se'ir anasa b'fnim. Now he says everything is the same. Mo'adechem, everything. But not everything, because there's one that stands alone. What's that? The Seir and Asa Bifnim. Even according to Rabbi Meir, that has its own unique korban, right? It atones for its own unique sin. You have to say two things. You have to say, number one, it doesn't atone, the Seir on Yom Kippur doesn't atone for all the three things that Rabbi Meir says the others atone for, right? And Torah Shachal Tamid. So the one on Yom Kippur doesn't atone for those. And and all the other ones don't cover the sin that's covered by the Seir and Asa B'fnim. See how that's two, right? This one doesn't cover, right? You could have theoretically said this one covers a new one and all the ones the other ones cover, but no, it only covers itself. And the others don't cover it either. So who eino mechaper kaparatan? Why is that? Kapara acha mechaper ve'en mechaper shtei kaparot. Okay, where do we get that from? That comes from that pasuk v'chiper Aharon al karnotav achat b'shana. Right, Aharon is mechaper on his karnot once a year, but the focus here is on the word one, meaning this seir that's done inside only atones for one sin, and that's why we say, right, it only atones for one sin, not for two sins. How do we know that they don't also cover those three seirim? Nasabachutz, Regalim, and Rashi Chodeshim don't cover the one that's covered by the Seir and Asa B'fnim because of the other part of the pasuk. Amar kwa achat b'shana. Kapara zo lo teh ela achat b'shana. Okay, now this goes back to the same exact rasha we saw with a minor difference. Before, when we had this rasha, we were using it to say, how do you know that what's atoned for by the chatat and asabachutz is not covered, according to Rabbi Shimon, by the ones on the holidays? Because we took this pasuk, achat b'shana, and said this only happens once a year, but we applied it to the seir that's done outside, not the one inside. Now we're using it for actually the real context of the pasuk, which is the seir that's done inside, right, in the Kodesh Kodeshim. That one, again, we're going to say, once a year, you can atone for this sin. You don't get another chance to atone for it. And that's how we know the ones on the regel, the one right on Yom Kippur outside, and the one on the Rosh Chodesh doesn't atone for the sin that's atoned for by the Seir and Asa B'fnim, which again is when you knew you were Tameh, you forgot, and you still haven't figured it out. The Seir inside on Yom Kippur covers you. There's only one a year for that. You don't get more than one. So that proved again why this one stands completely alone, according to Rabbi Meir. Right? I mean, it stands completely alone according to everyone. But Rabbi Meir was the one who needed more of an explanation because Rabbi Meir said all the other ones cover the same thing. Why not this one? And why didn't those cover this as well? So we did both those directions, and each one from a different part of that pasuk. Achat b'shana, right? One focusing on the word achat. There's only one thing that this atones for, and the other, there's only one time a year that this you can get atonement for this. Tanya nami hachi. Here's a braita to support this explanation of Rabbi Yochanan. Al she'ein ba'yidiya lo b'tchila v'lo b'sof, v'al she'ein ba'yidiya b'tchila v'yesh ba'yidiya b'sof, v'al Torah shachal tatameh, those three topics, okay? Sirei regelim b'sirei b'shechodesim b'sirei nasa b'chutz mechaprim, divrei Rabbi Meir. Okay, that's Rabbi Meir who says those three atoned. Now, how does this prove the two things we just said, that that this doesn't cover the seir that's done bifnim, it doesn't cover what that atones for, and that one doesn't atone for these things? So they say, look what's missing here. Ilu seir and asa bifnim shayrei doesn't add to the list the seir and asa bifnim that also atones for all those things, and kaparatan nami shayrei, and it doesn't say that those atone for what the seir and asa bifnim atones for. So that proves that this is Rabbi Meir's approach. Okay, done. Okay, that was Rabbi Meir. Now we're going back to Rabbi Shimon. And we're going to talk about this line. Rabbi Shimon Omer, so before we were on Rabbi Shimon, we were focusing on the Sirei Regalim, and we wanted to know, how do we know what the Sirei Regalim atones for and what it doesn't atone for, right? That it only atones for one thing, it doesn't atone for anything else, and why that one thing? And we had a bunch of drashot to get there. Now we're focusing on the Rosh Chodeshim, and we're going to say the following. Bishlama de Rosh Chodeshim, and really what seems to be prompting this whole question is basically we're going to try to figure out why Rosh Chodesh only atones for one thing and nothing else atones for that, as opposed to the second version of Rabbi Shimon that says, what do you mean? The Sirei Regalim atone also for what Rosh Chodesh atones for and also itself. So we're going to basically, before getting to Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, we're going to say, why does the first version of Rabbi Shimon not hold by all those things? So we understand why Rosh Chodeshim lo mechaper ad regalim, right? Even the second version of Rabbi Shimon holds that Rosh Chodesh only covers one thing. How do we know that? We saw that before. To Amar, I think we saw this, maybe not actually. To Amar kra avon. Right, we didn't see this. We saw the beginning of this pasuk. Otana tan lachem. If you remember, we said, right, there's one pasuk about Rosh Chodesh which says, Otana tan lachem lasetet avon aida. This korban was given to you to bear the iniquity of the community. So Ota, we said, right here, Chatat Rosh Chodesh bilvad, right? Only Rosh Chodesh covers this. No other offering atones for this sin. But Lasetet Avon Ha'eda, notice, to carry the iniquity of the community, Avon is singular. What does that teach you? That the Seir of Rosh Chodesh atones for one sin only. Okay? So that we get that. Ve'eno noseh shnei avono. And it doesn't atone for two sins. This is very similar to what we did with the achat, right? The achat by, again, whether you say it's the chatana asa b'fnim or b'chutz, but here we said, right, either the siyur asa b'chutz only atones for one sin, or the siyur asa b'fnim only atones for one sin, right? We used one was used for Rabbi Meir. That's why the siyur asa b'fnim doesn't atone for all the others. And soon we're going to see the same thing with the siyur asa b'chutz for Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so avon echad noseh ve'en noseh shtei avonot. Now again, this is kind of leading to the other Rabbi Shimon. Why don't you say, like the other Rabbi Shimon version, that the regalim covers also Rosh Chodesh? Because the pasuk there just said, right, avon. There's one sin that Rosh Chodesh atones for, but maybe the regalim could atone for what the regalim and for Rosh Chodesh's sin. So Amar Kra, but this we know because I just said this. Ota noseh avon ve'en acher noseh avon. Okay, ota means this korban covers this topic, but right, that atones for this sin, but no other korban does. So the combination of the ota natan lachem and the lasetet avon teaches you both those directions. Bishlama regalim lo mechaprim ad yom kippurim. Okay, fine. So now we want to say the regalim. Okay, so we just said, right, why doesn't Rosh Chodesh cover something else, and why doesn't something else cover Rosh Chodesh's sin? So that we got. But now we're going to go to the holidays and say, why doesn't the Sirei, we get why the Sirei of the holidays doesn't cover Yom Kippur. That's because it says, Damar Kra, Achat B'Shana. Remember, Achat B'Shana means you only atone for this once a year. And we said it was talking about the Sirei Nasa B'Chutz, the one done outside. So the Sirei Regalim can't cover that one. But, sorry, I lost my place. Damar Kra Achat B'Shana. Kaparazo Lote El Achat B'Shana. Again, what the other Rabbi Shimon's going to say, that the one, right, on Yom Kippur covers the regalim also. So why doesn't the first version of Rabbi Shimon think this? Because remember, the first version of Rabbi Shimon thinks everything has its own purpose and there's no crossover. So why not? Amarkra achat, this is the other one, achat, kapara achat mechaper ve'enu mechaper shtei kaparot. Okay, the one on Yom Kippur, again, assuming achat refers to the seir that's done outside. Prepare aron al karnotav achat b'shana. Okay, so even though it's talking about the one done inside, and finally we're going to get to this question right now, which is, how do you get from there, from the inside to the outside? Why are you saying this pasuk is talking about the outside when it's actually talking about the inside? But we'll get there in a minute. But assuming it's talking about the outside, one sin, achat b'shana, doesn't just mean once a year. It means this covers one sin. This seir that's done outside only covers one sin. It covers no more than one sin. And from there, we get that it can't cover anything additional. Okay, again, this is all first version of Rabbi Shimon, because obviously second version of Rabbi Shimon is going to understand things differently. But wait a minute. Finally, we asked that question we've been waiting to answer. Both achat b'shana yichaper and kiper aron al karotav achat b'shana, these two times, where you darshaned it, Rabbi Shimon, right, the way the Gemara explained it, on the chatat anasa b'chutz, but it's talking about the chatat anasa b'pnim, a totally different korban. So, Amar Kra, turning now to Amar Bet, milvad chatat kippurim v'itakosh chitzon lepnimi. This is something we learned before, which is when they introduce in Bamidbar, chapter 39, I think it is, or 38 or 39, when it introduces the chatat kippurim, right, this extra korban chatat, you bring this irizim, here it's Bamidbar, chapter 29, verse 11, it says, on Yom Kippur, you have to bring a series of chatat, in addition to the chatat kippurim, in addition to the one that's done inside. So now this pasuk compares, I've seen this before, the one done inside to the one done outside, or the one done outside to the one done inside, and says it's the same. So therefore, now we understand why Rabbi Shimon can take these psukim, which are talking about the one done inside, and say it's the same thing for the ones done outside because of that other pasuk which connects the two. Okay, that's his understanding. Now we finally move to the third Rabbi Shimon. Okay, the third approach here. We have Rabbi Shimon, we have Rabbi Meir. Now we're going to the second version of Rabbi Shimon, which is the third opinion that we're going to discuss today. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishmo. Okay, and then again, what's his approach? Just to keep reminding you, so you get this all clear in your head. I'm hoping by the end of today, all his opinions will be clear in your head. Rosh Chodesh covers one, right? The same one Rabbi Shimon said before, Tawar Shachalas HaTameh. But according to this version, the Regalim add the Al She'en B'Yedi'ah Lo B'Tchila V'Lo B'Sof, but also covers what Rosh Chodesh covers. And the Shiur B'Chutz and Yom Kippur covers all three, right? A new one, the one that the first version of Rabbi Shimon said is the only thing it covers. But according to this one, it covers that and the two previous. So Mishna D'Rashech, so now we have to understand this opinion and where he gets it from. Mishna D'Rashech Chodeshim D'Lo Mechapre Ad Regalim. Okay, so why? Right, the easy thing is to explain, which we already explained. How do we know that Rosh Chodesh only covers one thing? Tamar Kra, Avon, right? Remember, because what did it say? Laseit et Avon ha'eda. This korban carries the iniquity, singular form. Avon echad hu noseh ve'en noseh shtei avonot. So it only covers one sin, not more than that. Okay. So on that same note, okay, let's go back to the drasha of Rabbi Shimon. What did Rabbi Shimon say? It says, right, so the regalim should also not atone for Rosh Chodesh. Jamakra ota. Ota u'nosei avon ve'en acher nosei avon. Why would the regalim cover the sin that's covered by Rosh Chodesh? Remember we said about Rosh Chodesh, this korban was given to you. This korban and not any other. This is the only korban that can atone for that sin, which is what? A pure person who eats impure, right, an impure sacrificial item. So if that's the only one, how can you possibly say the regalim, cover that as well, right? Otalo mashmale. Oh, he just doesn't have that drasha, and that's why I put the big X's here. Okay, doesn't hold by that drasha according to the second version. Okay, Mishna de regalim de lo mechapri adi yom kippurim. So now again, we're going in the other direction. We're going back. The regalim don't cover the Shiur Nasa B'Chutz, right? What the Shiur Nasa B'Chutz atones for, right? Which is, remember, you don't have Yedi'ah in the beginning, but you find out in the end that you were actually impure from the beginning. You just had no idea at the time you were impure when you went into the temple. So, how do we get that? Because we already learned that. Achat b'shana. Kapara zo lo teh el achat b'shana. Remember, we're going to say this pasuk achat b'shana is talking about, even though it's about the Shiur that's done inside, it's also talking about the chatat nasa b'chutz. And chatat nasa b'chutz is the only thing that atones for that's the only one. That's why the regalim can't cover what's going on in that one. Okay. Well, remember the other drasha, achat, right? We had the second achat b'shana, which meant that the chatat only, right, the one that's done b'chutz, only atones for one sin. Now, that's not what Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says. Remember, he says the one in Yom Kippur covers three we got a problem. Why don't we say, why don't you say Yom Kippur also doesn't atone for the holiday, for what the holidays atone for? How do we, right? Because we already had this other drasha, which is in the same pasuk as the previous, right? We had we have actually, it starts off, and then the continuation of the pasuk says, so if that's talking about outside, this should be talking about outside. And if we just said that means Yom Kippur only covers, right? What's covered by Yom Kippur is not covered by any other sacrifice. It should also say Yom Kippur is only doing one sin and not any more. So how can you possibly say it covers three, which is what he says? So they say, achat lo mashmale. Okay, he doesn't have that drasha. Now, I didn't put X's here because it's not like he completely doesn't have that drasha. But what does he do? Now, pay close attention. He says, "Dechi ktiv achat b'si'ir anasa b'fnim ktiv." Oh, that achat in Kipera Aron al Karnotav achat b'shana is talking about the se'ir done inside, not the se'ir done outside. Okay, now we have something very confusing because let's just go back, and the chart really highlights this. According to the first version of Rabbi Shimon, that whole drasha, we were learning that, you can only do one, and this only covers, right? This one is only covered by this korban, and there's only one thing that korban atones for, right? Those are two different things. That all relates to the chatat that's done outside. According to Rabbi Meir, it all relates to the chatat done inside. The second version of Rabbi Shimon is going to bring one part of the pasuk is referring to the chatat done inside, and one part is talking about outside. Okay, that already raises a big question. Right? And if you're already explaining this part of the pasuk, is the one done inside only, right? And therefore, if it's not outside, well, then the outside one can atone for more than one sin. That's his whole thing. And that's why the outside can atone for many sins. Well, okay, so then they're going to say, well, if that's the case, the regalim should also cover what Yom Kippurim covers, because when it says achat, the seir anasa b'fnim ktiv. In other words, go back. That was Rabbi Meir's proof. Rabbi Meir said achat b'shanai chaper is about the chatat anasa b'fnim, but not the chatat anasa b'chut. And then you don't even have this drasha, because this should be about the chatat anasa b'fnim is the only one that atones for it. But the chatat anasa b'chut can be atoned by other sins, by other korbanot, and then the regalim should cover also what Yom Kippur covers, because that drasha shouldn't be. So they say no. La'olam achat mashmale. He does have the drasha achat, but shane hachad amar kra v'chiper Aaron al karnotav achat b'shana. Now we're going to say the following. How do we get? What we want to get to basically is that achat b'shana yichaper is actually about the chatan anasa b'chutz, and it's telling you, right? Only the one that outside atones for is only by the chatan anasa b'chutz. Okay, in other words, he doesn't dismiss that drasha. And is actually talking about the seir anasa bifnim. Now, how could that be? Because look at the wording. Karnotav are the corners of the altar. Karnotav de mizbeach hapnimihu te kapara achat mechaper ve'eno mechaper shtei kaparot. Had chitzon afilu shtei kaparot. When it says achat b'shana yichaper, that's just general. So it's talking about the seir anasa bifnim, but we can make a correlation between, right, the hekesh, between the bifnim and b'chutz, and say achat b'shana yichaper is actually also talking about the seir anasa b'chutz. That again, Yom Kippur is the only thing that atones for that sin, and that's why the regalim and the Rosh Chodeshim don't atone for that. However, when we want to say this happens only once, this atones for only one sin and not more, which is not what Rabbi Shimon says, because Rabbi Shimon in the second girsa says Yom Kippur, the one that's done outside, atones for three things. So what does he do with that? That part of the pasuk is referring specifically to the one done inside. And how do we get that? Because it says Kiper Aaron al karnotav. It's actually talking about the altar. It's not talking about the sacrifice. It's talking about the altar. Which altar is it talking about? The inner altar. And therefore, that part of the pasuk we could say is only talking about the inner altar. And that's why that part talks about the inner altar. Achat b'shanai yichaper is a more general statement about the sacrifice. The sacrifice, the atonement, applies to both the chatat anasa b'chutz and bifnim. So that we can apply, even though this one doesn't. And that's how we make a split in that pasuk. Okay, that's why it says, Karnotav of the mizbeach hapnimi is the case where this offering can only atone for one sin. But the one done outside, that's not referred to in this part of the pasuk. Okay, and therefore it can atone for more than one thing. Okay, that's the end of that section. Before we move on, I'll just review what we did until now, because it's a bit of a complicated daf, which is why I organized it in a chart to make it more organized, which is we basically went through all the different possibilities and explained why Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon, Yehuda b'shem Rabbi Shimon have three different opinions here about what atones for what, which drashot they agree about, which drashot they don't agree about. You can see that all from the chart, and how they, Some of them they might agree with, and some of them they don't, and that's how they get to their different opinions. Okay, now we're going to move on to a completely different sugya, which we're going to have to wait till tomorrow to see how on earth this relates to our topic, because it seems totally unconnected. Let's start. Amar Ulla, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Ulla quotes a halakha in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which later Raba is going to quote it, and Rav Chisda is going to say, what on earth are you talking about? So he says the following: Tmidim shelo hitzrachu l'tzibur nifdim tmimim. You need to know a lot of background for this one small line, which is number one, you can't redeem a sacrifice. Okay, let's even go further back. There's two different types of sanctities. One is kedushat damim, one is kedushat haguf. Kedushat haguf is a much more high-level sanctity. It's usually an animal that was bent for an offering on the altar. Okay, and maybe some other things as well, but it's items that inherently have sanctity on their body, as opposed to something that their value is. Like I always give this silly example about, like, you're going to bring a couch. You say my couch is sanctified to the temple. It doesn't mean your couch. I like to bring it because who's going to carry a couch to the temple? What it means is the value of my couch, and then you usually redeem it onto money. Bring the money instead, right? We're going to talk about redemption here. Right? You can move sanctity onto money, money then onto sanctity. Okay, you can move sanctity like that. But when something has kedushat haguf, it's very hard to remove sanctity. You can't just redeem it. If you have an animal that was meant for a korban and now you can't bring the korban, it's all sorts of examples and a few different halakhot about what. But the general one, let's say it's a korban Ulla, and then you for whatever reason you're not bringing the animal. We'll see an example right now in a minute, but what you usually need to do is wait till the animal gets a blemish, and only then you can redeem it. Because as long as it has kedushat haguf and it was meant for a sacrifice, it has to be brought on the altar. You can't redeem its sanctity unless it has a mum. Now, a tmima animal is one that doesn't have a mum. It's a completely good animal. So that's first number of background that you need. Second background you need is to understand how, and we learned in Masechet Shkalim, if you learned that, how the money worked in the temple. They would collect money from the machatzit shekel every year, and that money would be used. It was called the Trumat Lishka. They would take the money from the Lishka that they collected, and they would buy all the public offerings for that year. They would usually do it a few times a year. Let's say you bought too many animals, okay? You bought all these animals to use for sacrifices, and then you had extra at the end of the year. You can't use them for next year. Why can't you use them? Because they were bought with this year's money. Every year's money has to buy the sacrifices for that year. So what do? You bought all these extra animals. That's tmidim shelo hitzrachu l'tzibur. We bought these animals for the korban tamid, the daily sacrifice, and we have too many. So what do? Nifdim tmimim, you redeem them, even though they're tmimim, even though they're not blemished. Now, usually you don't do that. So Yativ Raba Kamar al Hashmata. So Raba was teaching this halakha. Amar le Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says to Mamti et l'chau Rabbi Yochanan Rabba. No one's going to listen to you. You're wrong. What happened to their sanctity? They were sanctified kedushat haguf. You can't just redeem it like that. It doesn't work. Amalet Atlo Tizbara. He says, what? You don't think so? I'll prove it to you from a Mishna. Okay? Atlo Tizbara de lo amrin kedushat shebehem le'echanacha. What? You don't think you can redeem kedusha on something that's kedushat haguf? V'hatzanan, it says in the Mishnah in Shkalim, Motar haktoret ma yosim. If they had extra incense left at the end of the year, what would they do with it? It's a bit complicated. Mafrishim mimena schar ha'umnim. Okay, first, it actually should be mafrishim schar ha'umnim. Okay, it's a mistake there. You separate money to pay the people who worked on making the ktoret. Okay, they got paid a salary. You put money aside for them. Now, mechalalin ota al ma'ota umnim. Now, when you put aside money, where do you take that money? From the Trumat Lishka. That has sanctity to it. Now, you take that money and you flip it with this incense. And then instead of paying them the money, you pay them with incense. So now what happens? When you take the money and you pay the people who made the ktoret, but instead of paying them the money directly, you then switch the money with the ktoret. So you put the sanctity from the money onto the ktoret. You pay them with the ktoret. Okay, now, when you pay them, actually the sanctity is removed from the money. If you would pay them directly with that money, you would take money that's sanctified, you give it to them, the sanctity is removed. So that's perfect. You now take the money, switch it with the ktoret. Ktoret anyway had sanctity to it, but now when you pay them their wages, if the sanctity is removed. So now you took this ktoret, you took off the sanctity, which proves our point that you can do this, okay? And you then pay them with the ktoret. And now what do? You take the new money from the Trumat Lishka this year, and you tell the people who you pay the ktoret makers, you say, oh, we're going to now swap it. We'll give you money from this year's this year's money, Truma Lishka, and we'll take the Torah back. And then what happens? The money, sanctity is removed. The Torah gets sanctity back on it from the Torah. It was basically purchased from this year's stuff. And that you can do. So that works perfectly. And what do you see here? You could say, right on my name of kedushat shaben leichanalcha. Can't you just say, where did the sanctity go? To which he answers, Amar leik, Torah kamar, to what you question me from Torah. Shanik Torah de kedushat damim. Torah is not kedushat haguf like the animals, but it's kedushat damim, and we'll deal with that more tomorrow, and we'll see how we figure this issue. Okay, so again, the first topic of today was all about the opinions of Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Meir, and the second version of Rabbi Shimon that was quoted by Rabbi Shimon Yehuda, how they each got to all the different details of which one covers what and why this one doesn't cover that one, or maybe does cover that one and all that. And then, and how each one darshan in the different psukim. And then we just started with this new topic, which we have no idea yet what this connects to, but it will eventually connect, about the timidim that you don't need anymore. You can redeem them. And by the way, I don't think I was clear. What you do is, I think I forgot to tell you one point, which is you redeem them and then you buy them. Maybe I did say this. You buy them just like with the Torah. You buy them with the next year's. You buy them back. You're only redeeming them temporarily. In the end, you're going to bring the kedusha back to them because you're going to buy them back with this year's. Okay, so what you're going to end up with is leftover money from last year because you're going to redeem these back into money. So the sanctity from last year is left in money. There's a whole rules about what you can do with money left from last year. And then you repurchase them with the new money, and then you can use them for this year's sacrifices. Okay, just like we said with the Torah, it was just the Torah was a little bit more complicated because there had to be a few stages there. Okay, and with that, we finish for today, and we'll get back to this topic tomorrow. Wishing everyone a Shevuot.